welcome you all on behalf of the Center for Kurdish Progress and myself. My name is Dastan Jasim. For those who joined last time, I have been already there and I will be your moderator for today. And let me introduce first the Center for Kurdish Progress, which is a non-profit organization based in London. It is an independent and non-partisan organization inaugurated in June 2014. It provides experts' opinions and debates focusing on the issue of Kurdistan and Kurdish people in the UK, as well as internationally. As a policy forum, Kurdish Progress organizes speaker series, panel discussions, and social events in order to progress the position of Kurdish people in the UK and to offer a space for debating Kurdistan's position in the world. Collaboration with the British Parliament, local and international think tanks, and academic institutions frames its core principles of action. Let me introduce our two distinguished guests today. The first one being Allan Hassaniyan, Dr. Allan Hassaniyan. We already before agreed to skip the formalities and skip the titles. So Dr. Allan Hassaniyan is a lecturer in Middle East Studies at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. He focuses on the historical and present situation of the Kurds in Rojhelat, Iranian occupied Kurdistan, and mainly uses approaches of political sociology. He further looks at Kurdish nationalism there, as well as some more specific phenomena like environmental activism. So I'm really happy to have you here, Kak Allan. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Zarspas. Thank you for organizing this event.
Our second guest is Dr. Kamran Matin. He is an associate professor of international relations at Sussex University in the United Kingdom, where he teaches international history, international theory, and Middle East politics. He has published widely in all these areas. He is also an associate researcher at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs and chief editor of Palgrave's Minorities in West Africa and North Africa series. Welcome, Dr. Kamran.
Many thanks, Dastan, and many thanks to Center for Kurdish Progress for organizing this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let's get started. Well, obviously, there is a reason why we are here and why there is a, let's say, lack of knowledge, lack of attention for the situation of Iranian occupied Kurdistan of Rojhelat. And I want to ask you, Allan, first, the oppression and the racism that Kurds in Iran are facing can be characterized as quite silent. From some people that might know a little bit about the region, they would say, well, you know, Kurdish people and Iranian people are quite similar, their languages are quite similar, and people sometimes underestimate the situation that is happening there. So kind of silent oppression. Why is that? How did that develop, especially from a historical point of view, that right now we would not see the situation in Iran so obviously oppressing? And how would you characterize this specific type of oppression?
Thank you very much. Starting with this question that the existence of actually a kind of silent, inaudible insult and assault on Kurds, Kurd in Iran. It does exist, and why it does exist, there are different reasons for that. It's related basically to the approach the state has taken historically, especially during the second Pahlavi era in Iran, which starts from the 1941 and afterwards, which, you know, referring to the Kurd as the Aryan brothers. And this concept has carried on by different government regimes in Iran. So calling the Kurd as the most ancient people of Iran, you know, the one which the Iranian are really old, their culture, language. So there is no reason that, for example, actually Kurds should have a claim that, for example, having their own autonomy, because they already own this culture, this country. So compared to, for example, other part, which is the Turkey and Baku, you can see the Turk quite immediately. Well, we have a short period during the first Pahlavi, which the Kurdish language, culture, dressing was prohibited as well. But Turkey, from the immediate time and keep continuing until recently, 1960s, the Kurdish language was prohibited always. But it's the way the Iranian have dealt with the Kurdish question. And then currently we can see when it's come to racism and, for example, not using, yes, we have several examples of execution, persecution of political activists, cultural activists, civil society activists, environmentalism, and so many others. But still, compared to neighboring countries, for example, in Iraq, we had a genocide of, Al-Anfal, more than 182,000 Kurds have been genocide. Well, you cannot compare, but still, you can discuss why the way the Iranian regime is dealing with the Kurds. No one is really hearing about, apart from those who are engaged or an insider. And currently, the regime is attacking the Kurd on their identity. For example, Iranian media, broadcasting, cinema, theaters, and all the other cultural activities have become a platform to like actually attacking on Kurd and their identity, humiliating them, belittling them. And you may ask this question, why among so many other nationalities in Iran? Because Iran is a multinational country, Persian, Azeri, or Turkish, Kurdish, Baluchi, and so many other nationalities are living with this territory. But why specifically Kurds? They happen for the other as well. But without exaggerating, the Kurdish society has always been quite politicized and conscious in their identity. So that's why the Kurds have been always, like, due to their resistance to assimilation, especially, been a target of regime military activity, regime's cultural, activity to, for example, firstly assimilating, and if not assimilating, humiliating and belittling. So it is some of those approach which the regime has taken. And then we see another aspect which I already mentioned, related to persecution of political activists and all the other activities, not necessarily political activists, cultural activists in Kurdistan. And it makes sense, make easier for the regime actually to avoid, he was mentioned, in medias to be criticized, for example, from human rights organization or people from outside pay attention, because it doesn't happen in huge bunches, small bunches, but it happens all the time. So it is some of those reasons we can see that Kurd in Iran, in Rojhelat, are not heard that much about. And another aspect that we are not hearing about, people in Rojhelat, is related to similar to other part of Kurdistan, in Bakur, in its time in Bashur, and even in Rojava. The Kurdish society, not just the political activities and activities of Kurd, but all aspects of life in Kurdistan have been so securitized, and the region is so militarized that hearing, doing study, doing research, and involving, like, actually with different aspects of this problematic is almost impossible for an outsider to learn about. And it has resulted in a situation that really this society has become a mysterious, unknown to people outside. And sometimes it creates a picture for people, even Kurdish people from other side of Kurdistan, that like having a picture that, yeah, you probably Kurd in Rojhelat do deal with the regime differently. You don't need to have a, for example, armed resistance, because you already have a province which is called Kurdistan, who will give such stuff. You already have, your Kurdish language. You have a historical root with the Iranian, with the Persian, and you can see what we have experienced is not happening there, but it's exactly happening in Rojhelat as it's happening in Bakur, it's happened as Bashur, and so on. But as I said, the approach the regime has taken has been quite different. They are, I think, they are more sophisticated. Sadly to say that, to deal with the Kurdish movement, the Kurdish movement for political, cultural, and so on liberation. And it has resulted in a situation that really Kurd in Rojhelat has remained unknown to the world outside.
Thank you so much for this great answer. It's really interesting. So overall, you would say that the chauvinism that is, in Iran, the Iranian chauvinism that is basically saying, well, you don't need to be focused on your own national identity. You're part of the great Persian family. That this is actually a very, two-sided approach, which is really hiding the kind of racist connotation that it has and the racist practice that it has. And also the point that you mentioned is really important, that that everything is happening on a day-to-day basis, this kind of oppression. There's never this one big event. So that's really important to keep in mind when looking at that. And another question that I have for Kamran is, I was wondering, you're dealing a lot with concepts of class oppression, and I think in Rojhelat that's really important. And I would like to ask you, what role does class play in Iran in general, but especially for the Kurdish population in Rojhelat?
Yeah, thanks. To make the conversation more dialogical, I would like to also comment on the first question, if that's okay. But please interrupt me if I overrun my time or if I talk too much. So basically, I totally agree with Allan's description of the situation. I think broadly, basically, there are two sides to why we hear less about Rojhelat. One is internal and the other one external. So the internal one are the stuff Allan already mentioned. One is, I think, the relative percentage or proportion, demographic proportion of the Kurds in Rojhelat is much smaller compared to the overall population if you compare with other parts of Kurdistan. That means there are less resources, both domestically and internationally, for them to be heard. But more importantly, I think it has to do with the very way in which Iranian nationalism has been constructed from the early 20th century on. I think if you compare it with the Turkish nationalism, I think this becomes very clear. So Turkish nationalism is overtly ethnic and clearly kind of negational of other populations. So the Turkish state is called Turkey, right? But Iran is not Persia. Actually, the first Shah, Pahlavi Shah, deliberately changed it to Iran, so that the idea of Iranian nation is not defined ethnically, but it's defined culturally. So there is a subtle way in which Iranian nationalism actually recognizes diversity within it. It never says there is no Turks or no Kurds or no Arabs in Iran. It actually accepts it and in fact promotes it. But what does it do is organizing them hierarchically when it comes to culture and political presence and participation and power. So this creates what is known in the literature, exclusion through inclusion. So the existence of Kurds, for example, is accepted and in fact celebrated as a sign of diversity, but that diversity itself is hierarchical in its operation and construction. And that gives a kind of an obscure image of internal politics of Iran to the outside world, because they say, look, they talk about diversity, as Allan said, there is a province of Kurdistan, there's a University of Kurdistan, there are magazines published in Kurdish and so on. And this has been always the case. So I think in that sense, you don't see on Iranian streets a graffiti saying, namutlu farsim diyana. You know, you don't have such a thing. Nobody said, oh, you're very happy and fortunate if you are a Persian. That's a very clever way of assimilation in which diversity is recognized, but is hierarchically organized. In terms of the external one, we might come to it later in the conversation, but I think it has to do in the way in which the outside world, especially, you know, progressive and leftist forces, see the Iranian state. And I think because after all, I mean, we could be only heard if people talk about us, and the people who are supposed to be talking about us actually misperceive Iran as a progressive state by virtue of being, you know, at the receiving end of American imperialism and so on. So I think that's how you know, what I would comment on that question. In terms of the question of class, I would contextualize that question in a broader question, which is that of political economy of modern Iran. And that political economy has to do precisely with the way in which the Iranian nation was constructed in the early 20th century, or Iranian nation state, I should say, but also with the fact that Iran has been, at least from the mid-20th century, an oil rentier state. Now, oil rentier states, or rentier states more generally, are by definition much more centralized in terms of economic power. So unlike, for example, Turkey, which has always had a kind of relatively powerful bourgeoisie, if you like, which has managed to kind of pursue its interests more or less autonomously from the state, in Iran there has never been such a possibility. In fact, Iranian bourgeoisie is bourgeoisie because of its particular connection to the state, because in the end of the day, what wealth exists inside Iran is largely 85% comes from the sale of oil on international markets. Now, that wealth is directly going to the state coffers, and it's the state which distributes it according to its political kind of considerations within different social classes in Iran. And in fact, if you are not in the state, so to speak, if you are not represented collectively within the state apparatus, which the Kurds are not, precisely because of the way in which Iranian state has been defined around Persianness and Shia religion, although the balance between the two has changed historically. I mean, you know, early years of post-revolutionary Iran, probably the Shiism was more pronounced, but increasingly we have much more emphasis on Iranians and Persian identity and so on. So in that sense, you know, the formation of, let's say, a Kurdish bourgeoisie, which would have relative power, would be kind of prevented by the very fact that the Kurds cannot be collectively represented at state level. But there is also kind of more dynamic developmental kind of reasons. And one is that at the point of formation of the Iranian nation state in 1920s, within Iran, you had a very uneven kind of political economy. So much of the border regions, including Kurdistan, obviously were much less economically developed. There was, you know, feudal relations, probably tribal relations of one kind or the other. Whereas central Iran, where the Persian ethnicity is obviously concentrated, has historically been much more commercial. It's been on the Silk Road. You know, there is a powerful bazaar kind of bourgeoisie and so on. Now, this meant that, you know, comparatively, the Kurdish region like Sistan, Baluchistan, or other so-called minority regions were economically already, comparatively speaking, underdeveloped. Now, the new state, in a way, its developmental policy was always also uneven in terms of investment of resources, industrialization, and so on. So that initial kind of unevenness and inequality in terms of economic resources was reproduced over time on a kind of higher level. And this has become even more kind of exacerbated because of the way in which Kurdish regions and Kurdistan more generally has been kind of securitized, which of course has to do the way in which Kurdish people have resisted their kind of subordination to the Persian state. And this securitization has also created a ground for lack of investment and underdevelopment and so on and so forth. And when it comes to, for example, public sector, which is obviously state run and quite large in Iran, in the post-revolutionary period, appointment in such kind of sector has always required kind of vetting and selection by the state on the basis of your ideological allegiance, political sympathy, and so on and so forth. So that automatically has excluded a lot of Kurds, because simply by being a Kurd, you are kind of a potentially a dangerous kind of element. Having said that, of course, is not the case that the Kurdistan is, you know, equally kind of oppressed economically. We do have a Kurdish bourgeoisie, which in fact collaborates with the regime, just as Kurdish bourgeoisie has done in Turkey or in Iraq at some point. And basically, this section of Kurdish society obviously is happy with a kind of a lower level of political representation, so long as its economic interests is kind of advanced. And I think a great example here is the question of the Kolbars, right, who are being daily killed by the Iranian security forces. Because we have to ask, these Kurdish Kolbars, the items they transfer, who they actually sell to, and who they buy from, you know. And this is a local Kurdish bourgeoisie on the both sides of the border who actually buy and sell this and make a huge amount of profit on the back of blood and sweat of the Kurdish Kolbars. So I would say, therefore, the question of class is quite a complex one. It is directly interrelated with the question of nationality and ethnicity and so on. But it also kind of implicated in broader, I would say, geopolitical situations. So, for example, I don't know, the rise of KRG in Bashur has created over time a particular kind of political economy around cross-border trade, which has created simultaneously both Kolbars, highly educated, often Kurdish youth, and all the kind of individuals who kind of risk their life for a daily kind of subsistence. And at the same time, you have extremely wealthy Kurdish bourgeoisie on the both sides of the border. But overall, if you look at the developmental level of region as a whole, obviously Kurdistan is one of the least kind of developed parts of Iranian state, and that's for the reasons I briefly discussed.
Thank you so much. That's such an important point, and I think overall a bit of class analysis is always important to put in when looking at the Kurdish issue, because really losing yourself in identity politics is not going to explain much. You will probably have to limit your research when it comes to then KRG, as you have already mentioned it, where Kurdish nationalism and Kurdish ethnic thought has really brought up one of the biggest bourgeoisies that Kurdish workers have to deal with in Iraq right now. I'm also calling the audience really to ask your questions already, or put in your questions into the chat. In half an hour, we will have a possibility to answer the questions, use the possibility to ask your questions to these two great scholars. Thank you so much. Really some really important points. One thing that I was actually wondering that came up in the chat, and that I am also dealing with a lot when trying to analyze the situation, especially as someone who comes from this border region, where you know, the Sunni Shia split also in the Kurdish population is coming up. I mean, obviously it's not a classical Sunni Shia problem, but what I found interesting is that, for example, there was a 2019 paper by Tezjud and Azazadeh, where they looked at all the fighters, the Kurdish fighters from Rojhelat that joined PJAK, and they found out that there is a significant effect that Kurds from Sunni areas are more likely to join. Now you could say, of course, well, in the people in the Sunni areas, more of them are Kurmanji speaking, there's maybe more of a connection, cross-border connection, and stuff like that. But I would be really interested from both of you to hear your perspective on what does the Sunni Shia divide mean in the internal division maybe of political parties. We've seen some criticism here about, you know, one political party might have done a good job or a bad job, but what is your thought? How important is this cleavage between Sunni and Shia?
Allan, would you like to go first?
Please, you start, Kamran.
Oh, I think it has to do with the way in which Shiism was central to the Iranian nationalism from the start. Iranian state has always been defined, the official religion, as Shiism. And I think both the monarchy and the Islamic Republic have tried, very meticulously to cultivate that dimension. But I think this was bound to kind of lose its efficiency, if you like, over time. Because the more Kurdish nationalism itself and Kurdish national identity has been able to articulate itself thanks to modern media, communication technology, and so on and so forth, the more Kurdish question has become internationalized and therefore is more kind of impactful regionally, the more Kurds who have religiously, so to speak, are Shias, have become more and more aware of the Kurdish national identity, which was not as probably pronounced as before. And I think so the more Iranian state actually leans on the Persian side of the Iranian nationalism, I think the more the Shiism becomes a less effective means by which the Kurds, for example, would be kind of incorporated into the structure of the political power. That's broadly, that's I think what, and nationalism obviously is by definition secular. So in fact, in a way you could think about Islamic Republic's Iranian nationalism as a kind of quite dynamically paradoxical. But I would say in the last 15, 20 years, actually, despite the appearance, Iranian nationalism is far more secular than what it was even before revolution, because it's much more based on Persian kind of center of Iranianness as opposed to its Shiism.
It's a really interesting perspective. Allan, do you have another perspective, adding a perspective to this Sunni Shia question?
Well, actually, I would, in continuation to what Kamran said, is going back to the 16th century, the emergence of the Safavid and their focus on using Shiism as a state ideology. And they really started with the Kurds, especially because of this zone. Kurd has been in a kind of buffer zone, which between two empires, the Safavid and the Ottoman. So, and it was quite important geopolitical. So this Shiism as an element of demographic engineering has played in the mind of the state, especially for the Safavid, not that much for the for the Pahlavid somehow, but we see the emergence or maybe using quite systematic through the post-revolutionary days and months and afterward in 1979 and afterwards after the revolution, the Islamic Republic, the Islamic regime really in a quite systematic and sophisticated way relied on the concept of Sunni Shiism. As you said from the beginning, it cannot be compared with the Sunni Shiism conflict, because the Kurd as Shia and Sunni, you cannot find a kind of conflict between these people, but it's a more matter of how the state, especially through these 40 years and 42 years of its Islamic establishment and its role, how relied on this concept in order to divide and rule the Kurds. It is quite a sensitive topic, because it's mainly I'm sure it doesn't matter Sunni and Shia. You can see the same sense of identity. You see this especially right now, but in the critical days you could see the regime in some areas, as I said, is a quite sensitive topic to deal with, because you can see the same feeling, the same sense of identity, self-identification among Kurds. Yes, that true, historically especially, and mainly through the Kurdish movement, Sunnism has a kind of patent and what's called as a monopoly on the Kurdish movement, like saying, you never say a Kurdish Sunni when it comes to identifying. You always say Kurdish Sunni, Kurdish Alawi, Faili, and so on, but not this kind of, and it has caused some kind of actually exclusion of the non-Sunnis. And this sense of exclusion, or the kind of articulation, has always been used by different occupiers of Kurdistan, not just in Iran and Rojhelat, but also in Bakur. You see also in Bashur. For example, the Turks started to say and work hugely on say the Zaza are not Kurd because of this kind of pretext and stuff like you never say, for example, in Iran, Kurdi Sorani. You say Kurdi Kurmanji, Kurdi Zaza, Kurdi Haurami, and it has really damaged. Yes, it's a reality somehow. It's something quite normal for us, but it has been used because it by itself naturally gives a sense of exclusion. So these states have been quite, good in using this. And in the sense of Shiism in Iran, yes, non-political parties, especially when you go back to the time of the establishment of the Kurdish Republic in center in Mahabat in 1946, and even Komale Zhekov, you see actually that Kurdish nationalism can hardly reach to this area, for example, Kermashan and Ilam. And for the political parties in a much modern sense, it was the case. For example, during the revolution, this lack of presence, this kind of organized sense and form of Kurdish nationalism, this exists, but it hasn't been mobilized. That's why you can see from the early days, the regime has used this sense of Shiism. Actually, it doesn't mean that all the society or the community in this region joined the Iranian, but you can see actually the regime has benefited quite good from that. But luckily, without being naive, this thing has changed really, without exaggerating it. Some indication is we see since 2015 and afterward, especially, we have some examples you can use as a sample for the change of this actually, division, because you see the rise of Kurdish nationalism in this Kermashan, Ilam area, without like actually, what is more privileged, it is Shiism or Kurdish. So you see the author of the Kurd, the no mountains, but no friends, but no friends, but the mountains. He's from Ilam, but you can see how he's expressing his sense of Kurdishness. You see during the earthquake in 2017 in Salasan Bawaji, Kermashan, afterward the flood in Ilam, how the Kurds from other part of Rojhelat reached out to support and bring aid to people in this area, actually. Then you can see a re-emergence, revival of more expressed form of Kurdish nationalism in this area, which is somehow quite promising without being simplistic and naive. So yes, Shiism, Sunnism has been used to change the demography of Kurdistan, to divide in sensitive era of time, for example, during the revolution. And yes, we see the lack of presence of political parties of the Kurdish movement in this area, though we can see a different source and way of mobilizing and expressing sense of Kurdish nationalism and national identity in this area, which is somehow a new emergence.
Thank you so much. It's really a great and important point. And I mean, at the end of the day, how states use sectarianism is something that is constructed at the end of the day, pretty much. I mean, if you look at the other side, on the Iraqi side, the areas where a lot of Shia lived, were sometimes even known for being very Kurdish, very patriotic, very engaged in the Kurdish national fight, whereas on the other side, it's maybe different. So yeah. Thank you so much. Let's get to you know, the present time, to the present situation. Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for the contributions in the chat so far. You're still free to, you know, put in your questions for the Q&A later. I have one question for Kamran. So Kamran, you already mentioned the issue of the progressive gaze on Iran. So we kind of have a situation where maybe in a blind or like very reactionary sort of anti-imperialism, people start supporting the Iranian regime, treat Iran as some kind of black box, don't really look inside of it. Maybe do stuff where you described it recently when talking on Twitter about the Zarif tapes, that it's quite an illusion that is built up, that there is like some progressive camp in Iran that needs support from the West, whereas in the Kurdish movement, like for the Kurdish movement, such a sense is not there. So I'm wondering, what would like a progressive take look like that can combine both a critical and anti-imperialist stance against US imperialism, and on the other side can be critical with Iranian politics, which is obviously very hegemonial?
Yeah, I mean, I think answer to this question is inevitably a bit theoretical, and I'm not sure it's a good thing to say, to speak theory in the evenings in the Zoom. But I mean, the left is a very broad term. So within the left, I would consider both Marxist left and broadly what is known as post-colonial critique or post-colonialism. And in a recent piece, which hopefully will come out later this year, I have tried to actually address this very question of, you know, the way in which what I call inter-subaltern colonialism is not seen from the lens of classical Marxism and also post-colonialism. But if I kind of try to make the argument slightly less complex or complicated, I would say that the answer as to, you know, what kind of lens we need in order to not to have this illusion you mentioned about progressiveness of the Iranian state, I think it has to go very deep. I think it has to start from the very idea of you know, how capitalism actually historically develops, because in a way, the way in which, for example, Marxists have historically understood that, they have downplayed, for example, question of nationalities or nationalism. In a way, nationalism has always been a secondary question. It's been seen as a kind of false consciousness of capitalism, which will therefore go away as soon as we have a socialist revolution. And yet, you know, the last 150 years at least shows that that's been kind of quite a mirage. And I think, you know, in a way, what, for example, feminist scholarship has done in terms of intersectionality is exactly what has to be done within Marxist political economy, for example, that class and gender and race and nation are not kind of separate entities, they are entangled. So therefore, if you take that view, then the question of oppression of, for example, Kurdish nation and Iran is not a secondary or less important compared to the question of oppression or exploitation of the Iranian working class as such, because the two are actually mutually constitutive. But more politically speaking, I think this comes from a Cold War kind of worldview in which you have a binary of imperialism and anti-imperialism in the world stage. So if you're anti-imperialist, somehow by definition, you are progressive. And, you know, I remember in 2014, at the beginning of Rise of ISIS, a radical Marxist Italian group, in fact, supported ISIS in a statement, which, you know, quite astonishing, but this happened. So basically, I think when you look at the world through that lens, therefore, a state like Iran is almost by definition progressive because it happens to be in conflict or tension with the United States. But I think that kind of conception is what I would call is kind of overtly externalist. So it kind of makes its assessment of progressiveness or reactionary nature of a movement or a state not based on what is doing inside its territory or structure, but what is doing externally versus other states. So in that sense, a state like Iran or even Saddam Hussein's Iraq would be progressive simply because it's fighting the United States. Whereas I think a political judgment on a state or a party or whatever a collectivity cannot be one-sided. You have to look at the way in which it organizes itself internally as well as externally. And if you look at internally in Iran, I would say you could easily make a case for kind of what I call inter-subaltern colonialism. The other issue I think relevant here is more about post-colonial critique, which is a definition of colonialism, which in this literature or in this approach is more or less Eurocentric. So colonialism is associated historically with the colonization of non-European world by European states. Whereas this is obviously is a very kind of contingent, conjuncture of world history, and colonialism more deeply is ultimately about denying of sovereignty to collectivities. And if you look at that definition, therefore, it doesn't matter if you are non-European or I don't know, Iranian, Arab, Turks, or even Kurdish in a kind of hypothetical kind of situation. If you deny some other people their ability to self-govern, then you are by definition colonizing them. And therefore, again, so that kind of Eurocentric conception of colonialism has made a lot of, what we would describe otherwise as progressive forces in the West to kind of directly or indirectly kind of, or implicitly or explicitly kind of support Iranian state. And the other one is a kind of what Sadiq al-Azm many years ago described as, Orientalism in reverse. So when a lot of leftists in the outside Iran look at a country like Iran, they actually see Iran as a homogeneous kind of society and culture. And even though they normatively kind of see it as progressive, as radical, as critical of the world order, which is dominated by the West, nonetheless, they fail to see its internal differentiation and a kind of structures of hierarchy around gender, around ethnicity, around nationality, around class, and so on and so forth. So I think this reverse Orientalism can be seen in a lot of commentaries about Iran, as if Iran is a kind of undifferentiated whole. I think there's one other issue which kind of reinforces this kind of naive view of Iran as a progressive kind of state in international relations, and that's to do with I'm trying to look at my notes, and I think that's to do with I think that's to do with the way in which post-colonialism, especially, simply denies the possibility of a general theory or general social theory, because it always sees knowledge as kind of contextually bounded and so on. And therefore, they are very kind of cautious of making any normative judgment on behalf or in relation to other struggles, because they would see this as kind of by definition imposing their views on the other, and it's a kind of a sort of kind of epistemological imperialism, which is, I think it doesn't have to be the case. It has to do with the way in which universalism itself is constructed in this discourse, but I don't have really time to go into it. So in terms of, I mean, the last point about Zarif you mentioned, yes, in that thread, I tried to explain that, these so-called factions are not mutually exclusive kind of forces. They are not representing different Irans. The two of them together form what Iran actually is, the Islamic Republic of Iran, I mean. Just the way in which, for example, Labour Party and Conservative Party in this country, in the UK, together actually form the structure of UK as a state. It's the same goes with Iranian kind of case. The difference is that you have here a kind of a minimal liberal constitutionalism in which you are able to express yourself and so on. Whereas in Iran, you have a kind of semi-fascist system in which this is denied to the others. But nonetheless, the idea that you can actually transform Iran through one of these factions, I think is based on a total misreading of what Islamic Republic is. And if, again, if you look at the official name of Iranian state, is Islamic Republic. It considers popular sovereignty and it considers divine sovereignty. And these two go together, exactly together form the Iranian state as a unit, as a kind of totality. And therefore, if Iran is only the republic and you take away the Islamic, then it's no longer Islamic Republic, it's something else. And if you take the Republican element, then it's no longer, again, Islamic Republic. The two are together, I think, mutually constitute what Islamic Republic of Iran is. So in conclusion, I think what you said, what sort of leftism is able to kind of transcend this, to be both simultaneously anti-imperialism, but also defending, for example, oppressed nations such as Kurds. I think it cannot be just done politically. It requires a much more thorough reconsideration of the kind of theoretical premises of, for example, Marxism or post-colonialism in the other case.
Yeah, definitely. I think the two sides need to work together. As you said, the class liberation is not automatically going to bring national or gender or other queer liberations. But on the other side, yeah, I do believe that both for science and for how the way societies work, there are some universal values. There are some universal points that we have to agree to move forward. So that's a really important point. Looking forward to your paper that you talked about pretty much.
Thank you.
And I just have like one question that I want you to just answer shortly, maybe with some ideas on what you think the future might look like, the future of, let's say, the next 2 years, 3 years. We have a new president in the United States. We have Joe Biden. Some people are wondering, is he going to continue the Obama course? He has someone like, put in someone like Robert Marley, taking care of Iran issues as someone who is known to be pro-Iran, the Democrats being known for showing their progressivity, as you described, and being pro-Iran. What do the both of you think? Do you think the Biden administration is going to be good for the Kurds in Iran or bad? Asked very, very easily, and I just want you to give a equally superficial answer. Allan, what do you think of some perspectives for us?
I think you're muted,
Allan.
Allan.
You're muted still. Allan, yes, you're muted. So
yeah, sorry. Well, I was about to say that I prefer that Kamran basically answered this question. My knowledge on this matter, this issue is so basically zero. However, the Americans have their agenda. Whether good for Kurd, I don't know. I think it's up to the Kurd to make them, come to the international agenda. Not Americans or someone else make them, important. So it is a task of ourselves as people, as nation, not the Americans. Though, yeah, it's true that the regional, the international atmosphere was going on around, or we are not isolated from this stuff. However, it is really up to our potential, how we are mobilizing ourselves, how we are using our resources. We are, as people, quite resourceful actually, though it is just depend our the society, our political parties, our scholars, how we are introducing ourselves to the international community and so on, because the Americans, their attitude to Iran has changed so many times. And we see, for example, while especially for the Kurd in Iran, despite all suffering during these 8 years, 4 years of Trump, similar to Obama and previous administration, they saw, especially when Trump acted on different stuff like Qasem Soleimani, believe that something would happen. But the Americans, they have their own agenda. And the Biden administration actually is not quite different from Trump. We saw the same people actually with different faces. It's just their mentality, yes, for their international interest. They may act differently compared to different administration, but they have agenda which definitely not regarding Kurds or human rights and stuff like that. So I'm not promising unless we as Kurds stand up for our cause and well, having a proactive mobilization movement.
So the actors change, but the interests and the problematic stays the same. Kamran, what do you think?
Well, I totally agree with Allan's point about the Kurds, the necessity for the Kurds to rely on their own resources. But of course, it's perfectly legitimate to also exploit geopolitical divisions and rivalries and so on. And the Kurds have done, not very successfully often, but it's imposed upon us in a way. In terms of Biden, I think the next 10, 15, 20 years, everything is decided and shaped by China, in the sense that United States' #1 kind of policy is to contain China. And in order to do that, it has to solve small crises across the world, withdrawing from Afghanistan, from Iraq, solving the nuclear problem with Iran, the Israeli-Arab peace kind of deals and so on. Internally, having a sort of kind of social democratic welfare state, which Biden has started. All of this is to kind of restore, if you like, American, what Biden calls leadership for the next big fight or competition with China. And I'm afraid to the extent that for that reason, US is concentrating on China, is trying to leave the Middle East in a way that it has some sort of regional balance between major powers, including Iran and Saudi Arabia and other ones. And that means that there won't be any kind of military conflict with Iran. And we know that even Trump didn't try it. So in a way, Iran is cautiously incorporated into, or at least they hope to incorporate it into Western kind of orbit, try to kind of, as much as possible, pull it away from the Chinese orbit and so on. So in that sense, there is little Kurds could kind of count on in terms of American concrete support. But of course, Biden has, gives a lot of emphasis to so-called human rights, which obviously, like Allan, I'm not very kind of convinced by it. But having said all this, Iran is obviously highly, what's the word? The state is highly personalized. So the fate of one person could actually change radically the politics. And the supreme leader is very old. And I think within the Islamic Republic, the mechanisms by which interfactional kind of struggle is solved in the past is no longer working that well in the absence of a figure like Khamenei. So a combination of kind of crisis of succession, if you like, plus popular protest could turn around things quite rapidly. And we know historically, not just from Rojhelat's experience, but from other parts of Kurdistan, whenever the central state is weakened for other reasons, for reasons other than Kurdish struggle itself, then there is a kind of window of opportunity for Rojhelat to be able to make kind of concrete gains on the ground. But yeah, I personally don't see that coming out from Biden administration directly or deliberately, but it may come out of kind of unintended consequences of particular policies within Iran or in the region.
Thank you. Yeah, our hour of discussion is almost over. We're opening up for the Q&A. Thank you both for your impressions, very important impressions in the end, I really think, because in the end, it's not only about objectifying yourself, but yeah, really about enabling oneself and doing something. I have a question and it's about something that yeah, might be good for Kak Allan to answer. The question is about the opportunities and the civic opportunities, civic activist opportunities that Kurds have in Iran. And the question is, what opportunities can they think of in Tehran that Kurds can invest on in promoting a Kurdish agenda in Iran? In other words, is there a hope for any sort of within the system and democratic change towards the Kurdish region? I mean, we had the big protests in 2018-19. We have, sadly, a great repression wave in this year starting from January 2021. So what is the window of opportunity that Kamran already talked about? What does the window of opportunity look like right now?
Well, thank you very much. The concept of civic activism, civic society, stuff like that is quite disputed one, especially for almost totally a authoritarian state like the Islamic Republic. So it has left the Kurds, like any other part of communities and nationalities of Iran, with really no opportunity for civic activism. However, it does mean that people just stay without acting. And related with Rojhelat, we see different tendencies which we haven't seen really. Making opportunities, because sometimes it is windows of opportunity, as Kamran mentioned, which has provided the Kurds for to operate and be proactive and create something. We have seen this example in Bashur. We have seen this example in Rojava. We have seen this example during several times in Rojhelat during the Republic, as well as during the 1979 and afterwards revolution. But at the current situation, we see, let's call it civic activism, because the cultural activism of Kurds, promoting Kurdish language in a time that state is trying to limiting, not promoting language, or actually is not prohibited, but the state is not really allowed on the ground to use the language of Kurdish and others as a language of instruction. However, we see different, let's call it NGOs or associations, small local schools run by individuals like Vajin, like Nojin, like I don't know. There are so many names that are trying to promoting Kurdish language and cultures, while state is directly on or indirectly is prohibiting to practice. And it's something quite promising, because the states in all, the occupiers of Kurdistan in all parts have realized Kurdish culture and identity. The language is such an important element for Kurd. So killing the language, the culture is the most important thing for them to do. That's why this awareness among the Kurds and civil society and small NGOs in different parts of Kurdistan, and especially in Rojhelat, it is something that that the people in Rojhelat has used in order to promoting their causes. For example, environmentalism, which we have in other part of Iran as well, because Iran is suffering from environmental issues in Tehran, in the center of the country, other areas. However, while in these areas, single issue has become a matter for these environmental NGOs, we see that in Kurdistan, environmental activism and NGO and so on have become a really platform for promoting Kurdish nationalism, Kurdish culture. So it is some area that Kurds are trying to use as a platform to challenge states' discourse on identity, states' policy and discourse are sustainable development, for example. Then we can see in Kurdistan different environmental NGOs in a quite mobilized and systematic way through their activities, publications, statements are really challenging these discourses, and it's something extraordinary because you are dealing with an authoritarian state rather than a democratic state. So it is something that people are using in the absence of a democratic, free political system that people can stand up against injustice. And it is something that you can call it as a factor of innovation, innovating new way of mobilizing against state oppression, state exploitation, states like plundering natural resources, which is quite important. And Kurdistan has been as a basket for food for different part of country. Let's look at Rojhelat. Rojhelat is called the basket for food for whole Syria. The same is for Bashur. It is definitely the same for Bakur. So in Rojhelat, for example, diverting water has been a trend state has during decades has done without really any pay attention and with no notice. However, right now we see environmental activists, Kurdish scholars which working with this environmental organization in a quite academic way through their researches, their publication actually challenging these policies and asking for compensation or maybe stop, because they say this region is already quite deprived. So why you are coming and take it? You have to listen to us and you have to compensate the people of this region. So it is something that people in Rojhelat are using as platform to mobilize their forces to in one way avoid destruction of the nature, the land of Kurdistan, but also try to challenge states' policies, states' articulation and discourses in this, in Rojhelat.
Very interesting, kind of trying to get into the big politics through issue politics like environmentalism. I can only recommend to everyone Allan's paper from last year, from 2020, on environmentalism and how that is really channeling practical politics. So I can only recommend for all of you to look at that. I'm still looking forward to your questions, so please direct them to me. As long as they are not coming, I see a general tendency that people like to ask some questions or like to see something about perspectives, about present day perspectives. But I just want to remind everyone, we're not politicians, we're academics looking at the situation, trying to look and analyze society. So we're not really a political bureau to decide in politics. Allan, please.
Sorry, just quite quickly add to something to this discussion. Just to mention, this hasn't been a priceless sort of activism, because we have seen huge number of Kurdish activists, environmentalists, journalists, civic activism. Actually, anyone engaged in any sort of this activity have paid huge prices for their cultural activism. One example that has become a symbol is Zara Mohammadi, which she has been given a prison charge of 10 and probably reduced to 5 years, because basically for teaching in a voluntary way Kurdish language without being involved in any political activities. So you can see the consequences and the prices is actually, the price is quite high, but they take it, these brave environmentalists and activists from different section and sector of society. Thank you.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Taking really paying a big price. I was wondering, maybe from a diasporic point of view, maybe also a question to you, Kamran. I mean, we know that Kurdish party politics have, sometimes done more harm than good, especially when it comes to diasporic work. But what do you think, can the diaspora do better to shed light on the situation of the Kurds in Rojhelat? What can we all do maybe better?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is related to that very first question about the silence oppression of Rojhelat, and I think the first thing is to do is precisely to become a voice for the voiceless, or the ones whose voice is being repressed internally. So that's very important. I think diaspora communities can play also a role in, and I think they have tried to play, as far as I have followed the developments, to kind of mediate between different Kurdish parties in order to, lay the ground for a more united kind of front politically. But I would also like to say something about the window of opportunity in the earlier question, which is obviously related to this question as well. And I think it's also related to a comment by one of the members of the audience, Yavash OAC, about the actual concrete political development. I mean, while I echo what you said about us being academics, not really activists, but I think Kurdish organized politics is rather different than popular politics, which Allan talked about. All this spontaneous environmentalism or cultural associations and so on and so forth. In that sense, I think Kurdish political parties are well behind actually popular politics in Rojhelat. And I think the reason for that largely is because traditionally Kurdish nationalist politics has been strategically articulated around military struggle, around Peshmerga. And we know, for obvious reasons of balance of power, this is impossible in the times when the state is not centrally weakened. So, I mean, it's simple. Anybody looking at Rojhelat knows that it's unlikely, or if not impossible. Even if all Kurdish parties were united, you can't simply militarily defeat the Iranian state as such. You may be able to, under certain circumstances, prepare the ground for popular kind of mobilization. But in and of itself, I don't think it's a balance of power which would allow that. So I think over the decades, since revolution at least, organized political parties of Rojhelat, not all of them to the same degree, but most of them, I think have failed to really strategically develop a form of political activism which is rooted within Rojhelat rather than in Peshmerga camps across the border. And I totally agree with Allan that Iran is not a normal constitutional state. So when you look at Turkey, despite its extreme violence, which is almost incomparable in historical sense compared to what's been done in Iran, nonetheless, it's constitutionally allows political party formation. So, okay, they are closing down HDP today, but I'm sure the moment they close it down, within a week, they can announce a new party. And there is a way for party politics to go on, and you can use a constitutional means to be actively, active in Turkish politics in some form. In Iran, you don't have that. So we don't have constitutional means by which to be politically participant in political life of the country as Kurds. Not, of course, you can, become a Kurdish reformist, and of course you are maybe able to go parliament, but that's a separate issue. And that's why I think what Allan described has become the center of gravity for politics in Rojhelat. So people are using, as you described, as issue politics to actually pursue politics proper. So environmentalism becomes a kind of roundabout way in which political demands are made, or cultural activities become the same. And I think this political energy could be far more effectively mobilized if organized political parties in Rojhelat had a kind of a vision which was not limited to military struggle, for which there is hardly any strategic means to pursue, especially if you sit in Koya or in Hawler or elsewhere, where you are kind of forced to abide by KRG interests, which is always obviously against the conflict with Iran most of the time. So I think, while repression of Islamic Republic, of course, is the main reason, and we have to highlight it, I think there are also shortcomings within Kurdish organized political movements in Rojhelat in terms of its strategy and its formulation of how to, organize popular social and political energy inside Rojhelat.
Thank you so much. We got another questions. I don't know whom to ask it to, Allan or Kamran in this case, but it's about how religious differences influence the Kurdish situation in Rojhelat. Maybe really quickly, we don't have too much time anymore left, but religious minorities, for example, other religious groups, how is that influencing the Kurdish community in Rojhelat? Who likes to answer?
Okay, sorry. Well, I think, well, such a division might exist and do exist, but I think it's not something that is really dominating this political arena in Rojhelat. You have dialects of Kurdish, you have, different, well, religious belief, you have Sunni Shia, but even in most critical, yes, I mentioned some eras of time which regime have used, but my point is the essence of the Kurdish national movement is quite secular. So even religious forces, we have seen example, I will just also mention another example which is quite current, which shouldn't be underplayed and underestimate their existence. However, traditionally, there have been those religious forces quite capable to integrate with the mainstream Kurdish movement. So Shia, Sunni, all the other, I don't know, never been a main issue with Kurdish movement, especially in Rojhelat. I think it's the case for other parts. You see, the Kurdish movement in Bakur in 1925, 1933, and so on. Actually, they have been by different sects religiously of Kurdish society, like Sheikh Said, Sayyid Raza. They have been Sunni, they have been Alawi. Really, the Kurdish movement, despite all challenges, it has been quite secular. So it's not a main issue of should result in anxiety within the Kurdish movement, though we need always to encourage more inclusion, coexistence and stuff with that. We have to all the time remind ourselves, even though we are all Kurds, so be more inclusive in terms of we may have some, if don't like the term minority, but it could be the dialect of religion minority. So we actually have to make a sort of positive discrimination to they feel more welcome part of. One thing which has attracted the attention right now is sort of Salafism in Rojhelat. One example we see in Mariwan, actually, which they are attacking people, which is in reality supported by the by the state. For example, the security section, the Etela'at in Mariwan, for example, is a city we recently in the states we have seen some conflict, which they have this small Salafist group which have attacked civilian in the city. So stuff like that exists. However, the state is using, especially in the time when they see Kurdish society. I don't know right now what the reason that these Salafists have attacked it from the state side. However, we have seen example the state has used the term and small Salafi group to either destroy the name of Kurds, for example, attacking Iranian parliament and say, oh, look, here we have Daesh, actually they are Kurdish. Otherwise, we haven't this kind of Islamists. It doesn't mean they do exist, they don't exist, they do exist. However, they haven't such a influence right now.
Thank you so much. We have one last question that I might ask Kamran. Linda is asking, Iran is a young country. Can the old Ayatollahs keep imposing their views on a younger generation, and are they more likely to reject their views? And do they have sympathy towards Kurds of Iran? I mean, we have seen both Iranians, let's say Persian Iranians, and Kurds protest in the 2018-19. Is there such a movement where we could say a new generation is developing?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, generational divide in Iran is very important. But in the end of the day, I mean, any effective opposition to a state always requires organization, which Iranian state has systematically prevented from taking shape. We don't have party politics in Iran in any shape or form, except for factions. So I think in that sense, you know, there is this saying, they say in Iran, that the Iranian state has remained in power for so long, not so much because it's so powerful, it's because its opposition is so divided and weak. And I think that's not something kind of native to the opposition, but also because the way in which state has been able to kind of decimate opposition leaders and so on and so forth. But you know, I don't know. I'm not like most social scientists. We don't like to predict the future, but on the basis of raw data, you would imagine that you know, a very young population and highly connected to the world like Iran will not necessarily be, you know, forever accommodated within the very restrictive system of the Islamic Republic. But in terms of their sympathy towards the Kurds, I mean, I haven't seen any proper research, but overall, I think Iranian nationalism is so powerful that even those who are opposing the Islamic Republic, not all of them necessarily, you know, simultaneously supporting the Kurds. That's an unfortunate fact, but it's the fact that you know, it does happen. I mean, of course, it's not limited just to Iran. You might have people who say, when KRG is extremely corrupted as an institution, but we still, in the last analysis, prefer it to, I don't know, a rule from Baghdad. But I think in Iran you have the same, but I venture to say that maybe the divide between Iranian left and the Kurds, at least in around 1980s and 70s and early 90s, was not as deep in a way, for example, you find it in Turkey. But since then, of course, things have changed a lot. But in the end of the day, none of this is set in stone. It really depends how these movements adapt their discourse, what sort of ideological perspective they advance, and it's possible to, you know, to gain solidarity from broader sections of non-Kurdish population in Iran. But even that again requires organization, requires ability to be, you know, propagating your views and so on, which is extremely limited, at least inside Iran. Sorry, it wasn't a very clear answer, but that's all I could say.
No, I am very much with researchers admitting to when they maybe do not know something 100%, that both of you did, which makes you, like, which distinguishes you from a lot of other Kurdish researchers that would never admit to that. So thank you, thank you very, very much. I really enjoyed this panel a lot. If there are no other questions, I would give back to our host from Kurdish Progress, but thank you so much. It's very complicated topic. It's a multifaceted topic. We hope that we could give a little glimpse into this topic from different perspectives, historical, economical, political, international, and hope that all of you enjoyed it. So if there are no other questions, we can finish it up so far. Thank you very much. Dr. Allan, thank you very much, Dr. Kamran, although both of you don't like titles. I will name you.
Thank you very much. Spas.